Okay, thank you. So today's session is about the principles for gaining meaningful feedback from people who use services and who we care for. And a lot of this has come about because of David's passion in this, and working together with David to look at, you know, how do we get meaningful feedback from people that we work with, and how does that help not only us, but also students. So let me go to the next slide, which is the main purpose of social work is a profession to work alongside individuals, families, groups, and those who care for them in order to establish the best outcomes possible for them. And feedback is part of that. Gaining feedback from them is part of that. So from there, feedback from everyone who uses our services, regardless whether you're from a private, voluntary or independent and statutory sector, is vital. Be it from a foster carer, a young person coming into the care system for the first time, an adult person working with them with lived experiences, or a carer who cares for a family member. So it's really important that we look at, you know, how we get meaningful feedback, how that's going to develop us not only as social workers, but for students coming in and practice educators working with students to get that feedback. Okay, so then over to David. Oh, actually, I'm just going to stop that. Deborah, are you still with us?
Yep, I'm here, Leslie.
Okay, there's a problem with that PowerPoint. I don't know why, but there's a problem with that PowerPoint. Can you pop the PowerPoint on, please?
You certainly can.
Okay, can people see that? If we can go back to the previous slide.
Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, my apologies for that. I don't know what happened there, but okay, so if we can go on to the next slide, that would be helpful. Okay, so, you know, we don't work in isolation as social workers or social work students. We have various things that support us to be effective practitioners, and Social Work England is one of those. And Social Work England professional standards say that as a social worker, I will incorporate feedback from a range of sources, included from people with lived experience of social work practice. So when we're looking at our development for our practice, whether we've been in social work for a number of years, whether we're a student, whether we're a practice educator that's doing it for the first time or experience, it's useful to gain feedback from those people using a range of sources. Okay, I'm going to hand over to David now for the next slide.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please, Deb? Thank you. Feedback from everybody is important. It helps us not only learn what works, but also what we can do better. And we've had meetings with practice educators in Worcestershire, and they've said to us that whilst, you know, when they were students, they were talking to people with lived experience. When they were doing their portfolios, they were having to get feedback from people with lived experience. But once they'd qualified, it hadn't happened since then. And okay, people get feedback in the normal course of doing their jobs, but perhaps it should be prioritised a little bit more. And regardless of its content or quality, classroom-based learning alone can't equip students for the complexities of their intended role. The importance of practice placement and the opportunities it provides for gaining feedback cannot be overestimated. Back to you, Leslie.
You're on mute, Leslie.
Can't hear you, Leslie.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Can people see the slide? Okay. So the feedback that we can get can help us. Oh, Deborah, you've gone. If you can go to slide 5, Deborah. Okay, thank you. So building on from what David said, their feedback can help us not only to learn what works, but also what we could do better. And I think as social workers, we want to develop ourselves, students want to develop themselves, and practice educators want to develop their students. So it's thinking about, okay, what works well, but what could we do better? So that feedback is crucial to us, really. Okay, thank you. And the next slide. You okay, David?
Yes, I think we've done this one. Can we move on to the next one, please?
There might be a little bit of a delay when I press next slide, David. It's the one that starts with regardless. Is that the one you can see?
Yep, we've done that one.
Okay, that one.
Lovely, thank you. So the opportunities that placement provides for direct interaction with people with experience in real situations is irreplaceable. We try at Worcester to give students a chance to come and talk to people with experience outside these processes and parts of the course. So if they want to ask difficult questions that they don't want to be asking for the first time when they go out on placement, then they can use us. But you can see all the different roles that a social worker may find themselves being, all those things at once. So that interaction on placement is absolutely vital. We have the next one, please. So all those experiences on placement, along with the feedback that they get, can provide students with insight and enable them to understand the significance of academic learning and lay the foundations of reflective practice. We ask, Worcester University asks students not only to get feedback, obviously, but to reflect upon it, and that's very important too. We were doing some yesterday, actually. There are some really insightful and good reflections that people had, especially when they'd had when they'd been working with quite challenging people. Can we have the next one, please? So feedback from people with experience and those who care for them. It's an essential part of the process. It's an essential part of social work. And students are also encouraged to seek feedback informally throughout their placements. We talk about the importance of longitudinal feedback, trying to start at the beginning of your interaction with somebody and get feedback all the way through, however hard that might be, perhaps to find the time, but it helps to form the relationship. It also helps to make the feedback a lot more meaningful. Okay, next one. So this is a bit of a discussion here. How do you currently gain feedback from people you work with? So if anybody would like to either put their hands up and talk about that or put it in the chat, that would be lovely. Over to you. That's a great one. Ask them. Okay. But face to face, on the phone, on Teams. And we mean service users, Deborah.
So Maxine, you sort of said ask them. Could you pop your mic on? Would you mind doing that?
Oops, I hit return while you were saying that. So yeah, face to face normally, but when I do that, I also give them the opportunity to either contact my manager or via email or however they want. I often find, even if you give them a paper form or face to face, feedback is often, it's lovely, but I don't always get a lot from it to learn from it. So I like to give them another opportunity to do it if you can, but
yeah. Why, Maxine, you know, don't have to answer this, but why do you think that there isn't that opportunity to learn from it more? What's that about for you?
for me, I think, you know, you look at the feedback is generally, I would probably say 99% of the time, it's lovely and it's really heartwarming. But there's often not something there that, I don't know, I can't explain it, that I can take and expand on or learn from, or, you know, nobody does anything perfectly, do they? But I often find the people that I work with, they're very unwilling to give anything negative. And is that a view that if they do that, if they give that critique, which is actually what we're probably after, are they going to feel they're not going to get as good a service? I don't know. It's really hard, I think, and I think it's really hard for students as well.
Maxine, that's great, and you're quite right. You know, if we as social workers find that hard, which you've just said, how much more difficult that's going to be for students, and actually how much more we possibly need to prepare students for this, so they are giving clear, concise, encouraging messages to the people that they work with about the importance of this and how we would value this. And that takes a bit of time as well, doesn't it, within that? But Maxine, thank you for sharing that for me, and I hope I didn't put you on the spot.
No, other than that, you just threw me because I was in the middle of typing.
Oh, okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so I've got somebody else that said pictorial aids. David and I certainly saw some of that yesterday with the feedback from their students. But Rachel, if you want to put it on the chat, if you want to put your mic on, that will be nice. I think we're rubbish at asking for feedback for us, okay, for students. So what are you meaning by that, Rachel? If you want to put your mic on, that'll be great.
Even though it's in, you know, the social working standards, I think probably it passes most of us by. We don't think about, oh, we need to get some feedback. I mean, I'm interested in what Maxine said because we work for the same authority, but it's certainly not kind of something that people talk about. It's not really an agenda item in supervision or anything like that. I suppose we do get feedback, and somebody else said we get feedback in terms of how people respond, and quite often people might say, thank you so much for what you've done. And I was working in on the learning disabilities team and would be working with individuals for a number of years. And when I sort of was no longer working with them, then I got really positive feedback. I got cards and stuff like that to say thank you so much for all that you've done. You know, you've changed everything. But it was only really at that stage when they knew I wasn't going to be working with them anymore that they offered that feedback. And I suppose I don't really think to ask for it. I'm going to be quite honest, and maybe it's something that I guess it's we need to get better at. I mean, certainly I sort of feel we need to get better at it on behalf of the students as well, and that was one of the things I was hoping to gain from this session, about actually getting something meaningful as well as actually doing it.
I think you've said something really meaningful there, and I hadn't thought about it till you said, but when you talk about sort of supervision, it's not in our supervisions. It's in the student's portfolio, but it's not in your supervision. So you have a supervision agenda, or hopefully you will have a supervision agenda, and we put you know, well-being of the students about that. But perhaps we ought to put feedback on it as well as an agenda item. So becomes something that's more prominent, that as practice educators, you're talking about it, as students, they're experiencing that, so they're more likely to take it from placement 1 to placement 2 into employment. But I thought, you know, in terms of an action, if people want to take an action away from this, that'd be certainly one action that I would be taking away from that. So Rachel, thank you for that. David, is there anything that you wanted to add? I can see other things in the chat.
Yeah, I'm very interested by what Ros has said about from the way people react to us, tells us if we are interacting with them appropriately. So that's a form of feedback. And yeah, I absolutely get that. That's absolutely true. I just wondered how you would then get that formalized, Ros, if for example it was part of Social Work England requirements that you got a certain number of pieces of feedback from people you work with every year, in the same way that students have to get bits of feedback in their portfolio. I wonder, how would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you would you'd have to then ask for feedback at the end, but I think I just wanted to highlight that feedback, you're doing it all the time, and if you're doing your job properly, you should be doing it all the time. So you would then, to get that feedback, you would then need to get it formalised by either asking them or getting a colleague of yours to then ask them, right, you know, Ros has been working with you, so tell me a little bit about that.
Yes. What would be your way of getting feedback from somebody that you'd found quite difficult to work with? Somebody who maybe didn't agree with some of the recommendations you were making, or some of the things you were saying. How would you get feedback from them?
I'd probably try with a written form first, but if that didn't work, then I'd probably get one of my colleagues to ring them and talk to them about it.
And I like what Jennifer's put as well, the exam question. Have they been the best professional you've ever worked with? And that sort of opens the door to, well, if they weren't, tell me about.
Did you frozen a bit?
Yeah. Jennifer, are you there? No.
Sorry, yes, I am.
Yeah, I like. Have you actually been using that one?
Yeah, because it's a difficult one, because it always touches on the power dynamics, doesn't it? Be, you know, asking a user of our services to comment on somebody who's still possibly, you know, supporting them and possibly still assessing them. So I work in children's, and often that's about family members who are being assessed. So to try and initiate that, because what we're trying to get to is, what can we do differently? What can we improve? You know, what could be better? So it's an easier way of getting there. Are they the best you've ever worked with? You know, people will often say, I'll say, how did you find them? Yeah, they were great. They were great at listening. They were wonderful. I'd give them 10 out of 10. Okay, well, the best you've ever worked with. Oh, no, they're not the best. Well, tell me about the best then. Tell me about the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. And can I come to Michael, who's in Warwickshire, and
Yes.
that you're trailing using a feedback app on your phone that staff can use during visits. Could you pop your mic on, Michael, if you wouldn't mind, and tell us a little bit more about that, because that's really creative and will engage with certain people, perhaps not all people. But Michael, are you there? Are you able to do that?
Yeah, no, certainly. So a couple of years ago, we started using an app which our staff can download on their work mobiles. So when you're actually out on a visit with a customer services, you can actually hand over your phone to them, and it guides them through a few very short questions, the kind of stuff you'd perhaps see on the student questionnaire, actually. And that then fed back centrally, so the organisation could see potentially quite a number of responses. What we did find is that staff weren't using it very often, whether they just felt it uncomfortable to use, I'm not sure. Obviously the pandemic then got in the way, because handing over your device to somebody face to face was never going to work. But we're kind of looking now at whether we do something internet based. So at the end of your intervention, you could give the customer a website and invite them to give feedback that way.
That sounds absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I mean, almost every other organisation in the country will try and get feedback on their service afterwards. You'll be asked if you want, if it's on the phone, you'll be asked if you want to be contacted to fill in a form. If it's on the internet, you'll be asked to fill in a form. Rate us on Trustpilot, all those things. So yeah, that sounds absolutely brilliant. Yeah, we'll have to have a look at the app. Send us details. Yeah.
And there'll be different authorities around the room here, or private, voluntary, independent sector. So that's again, so we were talking about actions earlier on. That may be something that you want to take away and think of. And certainly has, somebody who until recently had never had a social worker in their life. Then my elderly mother became quite poorly, and we needed the support of the local authority and social workers. And I can safely say we saw about 5, maybe 6 different social workers in a period of time, but not one of those social workers asked for any direct feedback. Yes, they would have been getting some feedback from the observations that they made of how we were responding to the conversation, and what was direct feedback from myself, my mother, or my sister. That was never asked for. So that was really interesting, because I'm working at the university saying, students, that you've got to get this, but I wasn't experiencing it on the other side of the coin. So, do we do it? And if there were more regulations, say from Social Work England, as David said, would we be more proactive doing that? But it's something that, as practice educators around the room, that you're going to be working with your students on and encouraging them. So some really good sort of suggestions there on how we pick it up. Okay. Ruth says something else. Standard supervision templates includes noting of feedback or complaints. So yes, so that's happening in some areas, but not others. So practice educators, you may want to think about that as something that you want to develop for your own supervision with students. Lots of feedback here. David, anything that you want to say before we move on?
I find what Ben's put very interesting, that he says that if we're talking about people from feedback from people working with the students, we pick at random following a direct observation. I know at Worcester students pick themselves which people's lived experience they want to get feedback from, which sometimes is a good thing and sometimes isn't, because as we've heard, it's very tempting to pick the ones who are just going to say how wonderful you are. But I guess if it's randomized like that, there's perhaps more of a chance perhaps for there to be some slightly less complimentary feedback. But also, I don't know what you think about taking that choice away from the students.
Ben, did you want to pop your mic on and say anything more about that?
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's it sort of reflect the learning, isn't it? Because if you go and approach somebody because you've you've sort of built a good relationship with the individual, and you know that the feedback will be positive, and maybe they've already given you the feedback, I just don't think it reflects the learning for the student, really. I think if you pick randomly, remember, when you're getting that feedback, it's not about making decisions there and then, isn't it, that the student has failed or the student has passed. It's about identifying areas for improvement. So I think getting that from sort of a random, it just helps to identify those areas.
And that's a good discussion to have with the student in supervision, and your rationale for that, and what you're thinking, and what they're thinking about it. So yeah, it's good to raise that in supervision, Ben. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah.
David, should we move on? And you're doing.
I think we should. Yeah.
Yeah, you're doing the next slide, so over to you, David.
Okay, at the University of Worcester, 2 pieces of feedback for inclusion in the portfolio are gathered and recorded by practice educators or on-site supervisors or observers during observed practice, and then 1 is gathered by the students. But other HEIs will have their own requirements. There seems to be quite a lot of variety there. I'm sure we'll get to that in a bit. At the next slide, please, Deborah. Gathering feedback isn't always an easy task. The observer's time can be limited and the student may be nervous and apprehensive. Next slide, please. We've touched on this just now. It can be tempting only to ask for feedback from the people we have the best relationship with, but sometimes the best learning can be from those we experience as more challenging. Can we have the next one, please? So be brave, ask for feedback, even in difficult circumstances. The people we work with may welcome the opportunity of being asked whether the service or support or intervention they received was helpful and how it might have been improved. And that's something that came across yesterday when we were looking at student portfolios, is all the students could see the importance of feedback for themselves, but not all of them could see the importance of feedback for the people they're working with. How empowering it is to know that they're asking for your opinion. You know, how did I do? What could be better? What did you think of this? What did you think of that? That's a very important part of working with somebody, and sometimes I think that can be overlooked. Can we have a look at the next one, please? So this can be helpful in circumstances when people are happy and also when they're not, and I think that's a fairly obvious thing. We have the next one, please. So we'd like to let you loose into breakout rooms for 10 minutes here. If you can think of some of the barriers and challenges for students and yourselves in getting feedback. I guess when you have students, you are responsible for getting a certain number of bits of feedback for them for their portfolios, and you know what barriers and challenges the students face, because I guess they'll talk to you about it. So if we can have the breakout rooms for 10 minutes and then we'll reconvene and see what everybody's been talking about.
Right, the breakout room's just opening now.
In a sensible order. Anybody got their hand? Oh yes, Jennifer, go on then.
We didn't really nominate someone, but I've scribbled it down, so I don't mind unless anyone in my group wants to jump in.
You go for it.
Okay, so we spoke about a few things to do with the actual setting that can make it difficult for feedback. So sometimes you're only with that service user for a short space of time, such as in hospital settings. Sometimes confidentiality isn't always there to make it appropriate to give feedback. We spoke about how there's an issue with power. If that service user is relying on the worker for a service, they're not wanting to say anything negative, or if they're being assessed, they maybe don't want to say anything that they feel might prejudice that assessment. Spoke about working with individuals with dementia, where sometimes it's the family who take responsibility for things like paperwork, and they may see it as their role rather than supporting their family member to complete it. They might do it themselves. Because sometimes it's difficult getting the actual individual. And at the end, we spoke about whether we call it something else other than feedback, because sometimes we don't get what we want from feedback. And someone in our group suggested we should be asking for advice for our students and newly qualified workers rather than feedback. And maybe that might give us more of what we want.
Jennifer, I think I like
us.
that in terms of, you know, sort of feedback, you know, advice, support in developing, using different terminology to engage with people that you're working with, to enable them to have an understanding of the importance of their feedback, not only for you, but for the service, for them and for people that come after them. So
Yeah,
so I like that.
Yeah, I'm going to
Yeah.
pinch it too.
Yeah. There's another action from today.
Anybody from any of the other groups like to feed back to us? You're going to keep it all to yourselves.
Say I'll go unless anyone in the group I was in would like to say anything.
Go on.
Yeah, okay. So I think we sort of commented on it's really important and often overlooked to seek feedback from people where we're intervening statutorily, if that's a word. You know, hearing about people's experiences when they've been subject to statutory intervention is really, really important. But at the same time, it does need to be considered carefully as to whether it's appropriate really to ask someone when they're going through a crisis about how did you find the social worker? And in those instances, we thought, you know, it might be better to wait a bit until perhaps the crisis was over, and then in a more settled situation talk to them about it. We also talked about students being very anxious about getting feedback, and anxious about hearing what people have to say about them, but also conversely, if they're getting positive feedback, that can help them to feel more confident about the practice if people are giving them positive comments, which I think we all said generally people do say positive things about students and newly qualified workers. Also really the importance of gaining their informed consent. You know, why are we getting the feedback, what it's for, what's going to happen to it once we've gained it. I can't remember if does anybody else want to add to anything that we said in our group?
I know that you spoke, I think, I'm sorry, I can't remember the bloke's name that was in our group, and he was saying that after they'd done their audits, that local authority made the contact, or was it yourself?
Oh, no, that was me, yes, sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And while you was telling me that, I was messaging my manager saying, I really think that we should do that.
Yeah.
That's a really good idea, because we're already doing the audit at that point, so.
Yes, so that was when you perhaps doing case file auditing.
Yes, that's right.
That you speak to the parents about their experiences as well, and then that contributes to the overall assessment of the social worker or student's practice. So there are different ways, aren't there, that we can do. We can be more creative, but we've still got to sort of make sure that we do hear from people using services, their perspectives.
Thank you for that. And I quite liked the bit that you talked about, is that the student is anxious about this, whether the feedback will be good, because you know, most people want to do a good job and want to think that they're good at what they're doing. So they're nervous about that. So in terms of practice educators, having feedback on your agenda, which I really like that idea, as you can tell, and talking about that, talking about how anxious we feel, how they're going to gain consent, what are they going to say, what words are they going to say. When, Ruth, you're quite right, you know, when somebody is in a crisis situation, and that could be an adult, it could be a parent, it could be a young person, to then say, oh, by the way, could I just have some feedback from you? You know, isn't appropriate. And getting the student to think about all of those conundrums, those dilemmas within that, and getting them to think about that. That's why I think it's really important that we raise this profile, not only with us in the university and David and Impact members coming in, but also as practice educators, you raising the profile of the feedback. So you're talking about it from very early on in the placement, right through to the very end. And when they go, to the second placement or into employment, that's something that's continued as well. So that's really helpful. David, I know you wanted to say something too, so sorry to interject.
No, I was just going to say thank you for that. And can we hear from any of the other groups? Anybody going to volunteer?
We talked about sometimes it's difficult getting feedback and the challenges around, do you know, depending on what you're observing, so whether that be a meeting or a visit, it's depending on how difficult that goes. So I think from a practice educator point of view, as well as a student, there's a level of, I guess, anxiety to, especially when it's been something a bit more difficult or a bit more of a challenging or upsetting conversation. I mean, my background is child protection, so there's lots of that at times. So I talk about, like, we often to talk about and make sure we set the scene a little bit at the start of those observations around gaining feedback at the end. So no matter how difficult it's been, you can use that as a way in to open that up at the end, rather than get out my house kind of situation sometimes that it can create. Because I think it's really off-putting for students that if something becomes difficult, that they think it's naturally going to be a negative feedback, and that's not always the case. It's about how they handled a difficult situation, and looking at that. And I really like the idea of asking for advice rather than feedback about developing their career. I think that's a great way of phrasing it, really. I'm just trying to think what else we talked about, because we did talk about some things.
We talked about that word feedback, and we don't like it, you don't like it.
Yeah.
So yeah, advice, maybe that's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know if Ben or anyone wanted to add anything else from our group. My mind's gone blank. What else we said?
Okay, so we've got 3 more groups to feedback, if anybody'd like to volunteer. Go on, Michael.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about is helping guide people to give feedback about the right thing. So if they've had a particular service from the council that then they don't like because of our policies, and they're feeding back they don't like that, for example, we've placed somebody in a different residential placement, and it may not be something the practitioner's got any influence over. And because they've had that experience, they're focusing on feeding back about the policy rather than the practitioner. So actually trying to get them to think about, well, okay, our practitioner couldn't actually influence that. How did they engage with you? How did they explain it to you? That could be a challenge if their focus is on kind of complaining about the council.
Yeah, that's exactly what we were talking about while you were in the breakout rooms. Exactly that thing of when people, because the social worker can't provide whatever service it is that they want. That's what they're focused on, and that's the only feedback they're going to give. So yes,
yeah,
difficult. Anybody else there?
Yeah, Deborah's just put something on there. You know, if people want to put it into the chat, so we can move on, because we know that's what time's moving on. Okay, so thank you for that. I mean, I think they're really good things, and it's a shame that this isn't longer. But I think one of the things that are coming out for me is the importance of you as social workers working with your students to prepare, to help them plan, to guide them about how they're going to get this feedback back from the people that they work with. And this slide, I think you've already sort of said that, you know, explaining why the feedback is being asked for. And certainly if I think of myself as, you know, an extended service user of my mother's situation, a social worker explaining to us as a family of, you know, why they wanted to get feedback, what was going to happen next, the importance of that. Talking about confidentiality and maintaining that to me would be exactly as this slide is, in terms of being reassuring. And I would have been quite happy to give, you know, sort of some really constructive feedback on that. So sort of thinking about, okay, how do we plan and prepare students for this, because it's not an easy task. And it also may be actually that a student is thinking about a particular person that they're working with, but that may not be appropriate because of the timing of it, because of the context of the issues that could be around safeguarding or mental health or any of those. So thank you for that, and I think you've raised that, which is really reassuring to hear. So if we can go on to the next slide. And again, I think we've spoken quite a lot about this already, in terms of all of you thinking about explaining to people with lived experience that their feedback is about helping you to develop as a social worker or as a social work student. And on the receiving end of that, you know, that can be quite empowering to people that you're working with, and it helps them to recognise the importance that is played in that, and giving you feedback as individuals or as students to help you to develop your style as a social worker, style as a social work student. And that can also be very empowering, very person-centered. How many times has a person that you've been working with been asked for their thoughts and their feelings about how you're working, how the student's working, and how that can be really empowering for that person, that actually they have a voice, you're listening to them, and they are important in that. And how, you know, I'm talking to a young person that I was working with once and asking them for some feedback, and they said, nobody's asked me for that before, nobody's really listened to me before or been interested in what I've got to say. And as a result of that, you know, how did that young person feel? So the importance of that, you know, but I think there is a real job for you guys as practice educators to plan and prepare, support and enable the students to gain meaningful feedback. Thank you, and I'm going to hand over to David for the next couple of slides.
Okay, I'm going to try and race through these next few to get onto the nitty-gritty. Take it on the chin. So give choices and take comments on the chin. The starting point should be asking people directly for their feedback and ensuring they're given the space to respond personally and directly if they wish to do so. Next slide, please. Different people will have different preferences about how they prefer to respond, and providing the option of being able to provide feedback in a range of ways can be very helpful. So in some cases, email or text gives people a chance to think about what they're putting down, and some older people may prefer to give written feedback. Okay, next one. Well, we wanted to have a discussion about this, but I think we're going to have to do it in the chat if possible. What methods have you and your student used that have been particularly successful when gaining meaningful feedback from people with lived experience, and why? So if you could put any examples in the chat of particular methods that people have used. I can think of people who've produced really brilliant emoji type questionnaires for young people, and people who've created really quite sophisticated feedback forms as well. If you can put any of those ideas in the chat, and then we can move on to the next slide. So, fundamental requirements for gaining meaningful feedback from people with lived experience and their carers. Can we move on, Jet? We've talked about most of these. Reassurance that comments made during feedback will not affect the service they receive, very important. Clear information about who will use the information, for what purpose. Reassurances about confidentiality and a choice of ways to give feedback. Information about how honest feedback can benefit the student and, by extension, service delivery. Information about what they can reasonably expect from the student so they can give a considered opinion. an opportunity to add or amend comments after the event with a clear pathway for making contact. This is one that often gets forgotten about, but I think is really fundamental. And courtesy, of course. Respect in regard to the levels of rapport, interpersonal communication skills and feelings, ensuring that they can say no either before or during the process without fear of adverse effects on service, and reassurance that sufficient time will be allocated to allow for both their service delivery needs and the needs of the observation process to be met. It's also fundamental you're aware of people's level of expectation, to think about innovative ways of seeking information where necessary, and be able to value the importance of comments and support people with lived experience to explore them where necessary, and include raw PWLE comment. That's another one that sometimes we have to bang on about. It's much better to have transcribed things in quotation marks exactly as they've been said. You get that with emails and forms anyway, people are being able to write, but if it's a verbal conversation that is being reported, to try and do it with direct quotes as opposed to they said that or whatever, not an unfiltered thing. Be able to identify relevant feedback and augment the perspective of the people's lived experience with comment where appropriate, and then give feedback to the people with lived experience. That's also very important. It's a two-way process, isn't it? And finally, again, we bang on about this a lot. You try and get longitudinal feedback wherever it is possible. Not always possible, but when it is possible, that's the best way of not only building a relationship, but also making feedback just part of the process, as opposed to a thing that's stuck on at the end in a panic, or a standalone thing. Part of the process is just what it ought to be. Okay, over to you, Leslie.
Thanks, David. Thank you. And, you know, this is some observations that we've made at the University of Worcester that have been picked up really. Between 2015 and 2019, we have worked quite hard as a university to try and increase the quality of feedback that students get in the portfolio. So trying to prepare students for how they can do that, and the key principles that David has mentioned, and inviting David in with his colleagues to talk about the importance of that before they go out on placement. And that was really heartwarming, because we've read portfolios between this time, and there was, as I say, a steady increase in the quality of that. The pandemic seemed to sort of put a little bit of a kibosh on that, for want of a better phrase, and students seem to struggle with the feedback, particularly with the remote working and the limited face-to-face contact. I'm just sort of interested, practice educators around the room, have you noted anything similar with students sort of since the pandemic? Just pop on the chat for me if you've noticed a difference.
While you're doing that, we had a student, one of the portfolios we looked at yesterday, who had a very interesting take on remote working. They thought it was an advantage because when they're working from home, the people they're working with can contact them far more quickly than if they were working in the office and whizzing about here, there and everywhere. I just thought that was an interesting angle on it. I don't know if that's anything anybody else would agree with or disagree with, but
okay, yeah. Okay, well, there's nothing on the chat, but that's something certainly when we've looked at all of the portfolios that we've noticed about that. So it might be interesting for you as practice educators to sort of think about that for your students. Has it been different since the pandemic? Has that had an impact? And what do we need to do differently to support people that we work with to give meaningful feedback?
Jennifer's Jennifer's just put that she's got some final placement students who've never worked or had to speak to somebody they don't know outside of education. Wow.
Yeah.
How are you going to manage that, Jennifer?
It's been a steep learning curve for them, obviously, but in terms of getting feedback, even just initiating those conversations has been really difficult. And some of our students have said things like, you know, just the very basics of practice, getting up every day and coming into a workplace is difficult because they've been learning from their bedroom for the past, you know, 2 years, 3 years. It's really stark.
Yeah. So, you know, you may find with students that are going out, we've got MA students that just started this week. The first years are going out on 23rd of May. So you may find some of that as well, because they were part of that pandemic period. Hopefully things will get easier, but we've certainly noticed it. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Yeah, virtual placements. Thanks, Emma, for that. And this is just some feedback that we wanted to give to you, really, whilst we're looking at the portfolios. Our impact members, as well as the university, are very keen on the voice of the person that you're getting feedback from. And in our experience, that we've noticed that practice educators, on-site supervisors, or the observer when they obtain feedback, there could be more comprehensive verbatim comments from people with lived experiences. So their words, as opposed to what we're writing down. So actually write down their words and use their words and share that with students. So one of the things that we would like to see in the portfolios from practice educators is that more verbatim feedback. If they are doing you're having a conversation, say after direct observations. So any thoughts how, I know it's the end of the day, so I'm not sure how much we'll get, but any thoughts how that might be taken forward from practice educators when you're obtaining the feedback for your student? Either pop it on the chat, or it's always nice to put a mic on. I prefer to speak to people.
I was just going to say, forgot what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Tell me the question again.
The verbatim comments from people with lived experiences and how you might take that forward in your own practice.
Well, I was going to say, I always do that anyway with the people that I'm seeking feedback from, but I also sort of try, and if they just go, yes, they were great, I always try to sort of tease a little bit more out of them, use clarifying questions and paraphrasing just to try and get them to say a little bit more. Sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And yeah, I do always write down exactly what the person said, because I think it makes it a bit more real, doesn't it, for the student?
And then give that directly to the student to
always straight
reflect
away
on. Absolutely. You know, to reflect on, to put in their portfolio. And certainly I know David had some examples yesterday where it was verbatim, and it was great. It was absolutely great to see, but not all practice educators do that. So again, that might be an action for you to think about as a practice educator, and how you might want to do that. But Ruth, thank you for that. Thank you for your contributions in that. Does anybody else want to say anything or pop anything in the chat before we go to the next slide? Okay. Before we go through this slide, and I'm going to leave David to do this, if you don't mind, is sort of thinking about some of the things I think that have come through today in terms of terminology and feedback or advice. That was one good one. Do we put feedback on our supervision agendas, so it raises the profile of it? Thinking about the anxiety of that, for the student, and how you can sort of manage that with the student. And also the other one that Ruth was just talking about, that verbatim feedback from that you get as the observer from the person with the lived experiences. So just sort of thinking about those as possible actions that you might want to take forward. David, over to you.
Thank you. I'm quite interested by the fact that a lot of people have mentioned being very conscious of the power imbalance and being conscious of people not wanting to give negative feedback in case it rebounds on them, which is a very understandable thing for people to think. So I think it's trying to think creatively of ways around that, which is very difficult to do, and will be very individually tailored. There isn't going to be a one size fits all for that, but trying to think creatively of ways that those barriers might be at least lessened a little bit. And the other one, I had the privilege of working with some students from Warwick the other week, and on the apprenticeship program, and they have to get 10 pieces of feedback a year apparently. I was absolutely amazed, and quite I thought that was brilliant, and I was just wondering if perhaps that's another way to go, because it seems that sometimes, not always, quite rarely, I suppose, it's seen as a bit of an afterthought, something that you have to do. It's a little bit, if you like the tick boxes you have to do for your CPD, for Social Work England. Oh God, I've done 2 courses, I'm going to do. Yeah, it's seen as a bit of a tick box exercise, as opposed to being an integral, meaningful and necessary part of the process. So perhaps the more feedback that students have to get, maybe the more they'll continue to do that in their professional practice once they're out there in the world. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to Deborah and Adam, and thank you Leslie letting me do this.
Thank you David too. Thank you David too. Are there any final questions before we leave, or people dashing off to do what they need to do? Just pop it on the chat. Okay, thank you. Well, I hope it was being useful, and have a good evening everybody.
Thank you very much, Leslie and David. Thank you for closing our conference today with a really interesting session. It's got some good discussion going as well, and as Ruth was saying, I think some really good food for thought for us, and when we're thinking about how we're getting feedback and the methods that we use. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending as well. And we'd love your feedback. So when you are sent the link, it'd be great if you could provide your feedback on the sessions and the conference as a whole as well. And thank you, Practice Education.